Verbs. They're what you do. So let's talk about verbs today. All clauses are made up of a subject, noun or pronoun, and a verb. Verbs explain what a subject is or that subject's current state, meaning what is the subject currently doing. So understanding verbs is part of the basics of English grammar. Our learning targets today are I can identify the verb in a clause, and I can determine the difference between action and state of being or thinking verbs. Our text connection is the story Grounded from our My Perspectives workbook. A verb is a word that shows either action or state of being about a subject in a clause. Examples that show action could be drive, listen, drag, sang, ran, sit, talk, laugh, and cried. Examples that show state of being could be know, was, had, would, were, felt, get, could, and have. Here are some example sentences showing how you would use these. Growing up, I didn't really know my grandmother. The underlined verb know here is describing the subject state. The I in her sentence didn't know her grandmother. So that's something about her state of being. To me, she talked in Spanish. I talked back in English. Talked here is an action verb. It's describing what the she is doing. We understood each other. Understood is telling us what the we did. Or she had a 1960s red Chevy Impala convertible that was all her own. Had is describing her state of being, that she had the car. And finally, driving was her independence, her freedom. Was is the verb here, describing something about hers state. Can you find the verbs in the following sentences? Take a pause and remember that in English, the grammatical pattern is always subject, then verb. So if you can figure out who or what the subject of the sentence is about, then you can find the verb. Here are the answers. In the first sentence, I felt sick at the thought of Grandma giving up her car. So felt is the verb. I is the subject. And the second one, I knew that without her wheels, she'd feel ordinary, just another grandma, hovering and wise. Knew is the verb, and I is the subject. And my parents had grounded me for the weekend of Louisa's party, easily the social event of the season. Had grounded is the verb describing what the parents did. Finally, no way was I going to miss it. Here, this is breaking the pattern a little bit. I is the subject, and was is the verb. Was is describing I's state of being. Action versus state of being. So an action verb describes what a subject does or is doing. For example, I drive a red Nissan. A state of being verb, also called a linking verb, identifies who or what a noun is, was, or will be. In other words, it describes the subject's state. So for example, my red Nissan has many dents. My red Nissan is the subject here, and I'm describing something about it with the word has. So I'm describing its state. Hooray for hail damage. Action versus state of being or linking verbs continued. True state of being verbs are the ones that are always linking verbs. They do not describe the action, but always describe the subject's state or link it to the next piece of information. The most common true linking verbs are forms of to be, to become, and to seem. Here are more examples of true state of being or linking verbs. All of the words listed here cannot ever be an action verb. They are always state of being verbs. It's a really good idea to pause this slide here and take a note of these words. Action versus state of being or linking verbs continued. Some verbs can be both action and state of being verbs. Here's an example. If I said, I tasted the apple, I am the subject, tasted is what I'm doing. In this case, the word tasted is functioning as an action verb. However, tasted can also be a linking verb. If I said the apple tasted rotten, here I'm describing something about the apple's state. So tasted is a state of being verb. Here's another example. Looked can be an action verb. I looked at the fantasy section first to find a book. Looked can also be a state of being verb, such as the novel looked really interesting when I saw the cover art on the library shelf. In this second example, the novel is not doing the looking. The verb looked is describing something about the novel's state. Here's one more example. Felt can be an action verb. I could say, I felt the puppy's soft fur as I held it in my arms. That's something I am doing. Or I could use it to talk about the puppy's state of being. I could say, the puppy's fur felt soft. Can you determine whether the identified verbs are action or state of being? The first one, in the story Grounded, the grandma loved her car, would be an action verb. The second, the car represented freedom for her, is a state of being or linking verb. The third, in her car she liked to blast the radio, is an action verb. The fourth, the narrator's parents were concerned about the grandma's driving, is a state of being or linking verb. And finally, the grandma refused to stop driving is an action verb. As a review, our learning targets were that you could identify a verb within a clause. Remember that in the English language, typically, but not always, it goes subject, verb, object. So if you can find who or what the sentence is about, you should be able to find the verb within the sentence. Our second learning target was I can determine the difference between action and state of being verbs. Remember, a verb describes either action or state of being about the subject of a sentence. There are two types of verbs, action and state of being or linking verbs. Verbs are not just what you do. They're also an important grammatical tool for understanding the subject in a sentence or clause. Thank you for listening.